Okay, I'd like to convene the Ways and Means Committee. We do have a quorum, and we have the minutes for the March 4th meeting in the packets. When I came in, Representative Mullery, you were here. Did you look at the minutes?
Oh, very thoroughly.
Would you care to make a motion?
I'll move the minutes.
Okay, Representative Mullery moves approval of minutes. Any discussion? Seeing none, then all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? No. Motion carried. Just by way of information, some of you may remember that we did have the LCCMR bill scheduled for this morning. We've moved that to Wednesday evening. So people should be prepared for that bill as well. And then on Wednesday evening, it is our plan to take up the House budget resolution setting the targets for the various committees. So we'll do that that evening as well. So we'll have at least one bill, maybe one other, and then the House budget resolution Wednesday night. So this morning we're going to take up the Nelson bill. Oh, there he is. Dealing with transportation ombudsman, and then the Commissioner Showalter and Assistant Commissioner or Budget Director Kelly will give us an update on the budget changes as a result of the governor's revised budget. So, the other thing is, in your packets, there was a handout for a budget for a better Minnesota, and that was the one that we had earlier, but I understand the department did an update, and that's the one that was just handed out to you over the weekend. So just know you don't get confused between the one that was originally in your packet and then the one that was handed out. So Representative Nelson, if you're ready to present the bill, and as Representative Hornstein here, that was the committee of origin. I guess not. So the chair moves that House File 152 be recommended to pass.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, committee. Good morning. This bright, sunny day we have this morning. Anyway, what the Ombudsman bill does is, back in after the bridge collapse, the 35W bridge collapse, Commissioner Sorrell created this office of the Ombudsman so that individuals having issues with MnDOT could have one place to go, and if they've been fighting an issue with the people on the job, on the ground in that area, the Ombudsman would report directly to the Commissioner. And with the Commissioner leaving and with a new Commissioner coming on, some citizens came to me, and some of our staff came to me also, because they use this position, and that's when they have issues, they deal with the Ombudsman's office. And so the idea was to make this a permanent position, so that, because it saves stress between our citizens and the MnDOT, the large agency that it is, and it's actually brought down lawsuits and helps solve grievances and get them solved. And I got three examples. One that may seem trivial is up in Deer River, homeowner, MnDOT did some work on the road and created a puddle right in front of this lady's mailbox. And every day when she get her mail, she'd have to walk through this puddle. And the Ombudsman came out and realized that there was a simple fix to it, worked with the post office, worked with MnDOT, and got the problem fixed. And so now the lady doesn't have to walk through a puddle to get her mail in the morning. Now, that may seem trivial, but the third one I give here is probably the biggest example is during road construction, Highway 61, in the southeast metro area, a landowner or a homeowner had major structural damage to their house. And the contractor, their insurance agent, fought, saying it wasn't their fault, and this person was not getting any satisfaction, and they went to the Ombudsman. The ombudsman came out, saw the situation, looked it over, and realized, yes, it was caused by the MnDOT's construction on the road, and they got the person enough money to get their house fixed. And that's kind of what this is about. And that's why I think this is we should be a permanent position, and that's why we're moving into there. And that's the reason why I'm here, is because we're moving it from a temporary position that the governor, that the commissioner can get rid of it at times that he wants, to a permanent position that's in the budget, and so it has tails. And that's why I understand why it's here. Currently, there's the ombudsman, and then there's 4 other people working in that office, and they go around and help solve these issues with our citizens and MnDOT. And it's good for the state of Minnesota.
Okay, are there any questions?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Representative, it says that there's been about 500 cases since it was opened in '08, so looks to me like about 100 a year, and then we're paying 5 staff people to solve, on average, 2 cases a week. Do you know what the cost per case is?
Representative
Nelson.
Mr. Chairman and Representative, no, I don't. I don't know I don't have those figures.
Well, Mr. Chair, I'm not
Representative Holberg.
disagreeing with the need for the office, but if you tell me that there's 5 people in an office solving on average 2 problems a week, that seems a little staff heavy to me.
Representative Nelson.
Representative Holberg and Chairman, that like I said, they recently just added 1 more position because of the staff load. They also, from what I was told, they deal with some of the political stuff that we used to deal with, that Mr. Peterson used to deal with at MnDOT, and he does other stuff, some of the interactions.
And, Mr. Chair,
Representative Holberg.
thank you. Could you define political stuff?
I guess Mr. Peterson could probably answer that better than I could, and maybe he has an idea.
Maybe while Mr. Peterson is coming forward, I see a couple of people in the audience that might be here for the LCCMR bill, and that was moved to Wednesday night.
Morning, Mr. Chairman. I'm Scott Peterson from MnDOT, and someone could please repeat the question for me.
Well,
Representative Holberg.
Mr. Chair, in response to my question about why we would need 5 people in an office to solve on average 2 cases a week in the ombudsman office, the bill author stated they also dealt with political issues, and I was asking him to define what additional work they were doing besides that of the ombudsman.
Sure, Mr. Chairman, Representative Holberg. I think some of the things that Representative Nelson was referring to is quite often during the legislative session, members would get questions or they would have some issue with MnDOT that they would want to address, and in the past, those most often would come to me and the people that work with me, and we would try to address those things. And now, to a great extent, those calls go directly to the Ombudsman's office.
And Mr. Chair, if you might, Mr. Peterson, if you could maybe delineate the need for 5 individuals and the additional workload. I mean, the information we have before us thus far is that they've worked on 500 cases since 2008, just with some really rough math, 5 years of operation. That's about 100 cases a year, or 2 a week, it seems to me, unless there's a lot of other work being done, but that's a pretty staff-heavy office.
Mr. Peterson.
Mr. Chairman and Representative Holberg, I am not familiar with all the things that go on there or all the cases that they handle, so I can't really speak directly to the workload, but I would say that some of these issues tend to be a little bit thorny, especially if they, say we have a couple of instances, maybe even 3 or 4 around the metro area where there are neighborhoods that have a concern about noise walls in their community. Either they want an additional noise wall or they don't want a noise wall. We have instances of both. And it takes a lot of time and effort to work with the members of the community. There are several community meetings involved, working with the staff people on projects and trying to figure out where the solution is. And sometimes we go back and do some additional work to try to provide additional assurance to the community that in the neighborhood that we're considering all people's interests, and we're following our processes and try to help them understand. So I do know, just from my own personal involvement in some of those instances, that some of these issues really are time-consuming. Some of them are more straightforward, like if we did a road project and left a pothole at the end of someone's driveway. But even then, in some instances, the ombudsman staff would go out to that location, take a look at the situation, kind of with maybe someone from the MnDOT office and the adjacent landowner or resident, and try to figure out exactly what happened and what a solution might be that would be agreeable to both parties. We have some occasions where our projects have altered some drainage, which, maybe an adjacent landowner now feels that more water is running over his or her land, and that's creating an issue. So, all I can say is that some of them are surprisingly complicated and time-consuming. But beyond that, I can't really speak to their
Thank
workload.
you.
Okay, any other discussion? Well, seeing none, then I'll renew my motion that House File 152 be recommended to pass and placed on the general register. Any further discussion? Seeing none, then all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? No. Motion carried. Thank you. We'll now move to the department, and being that a few people entered the room after I made the announcement, there were two handouts where it says Budget for a Better Minnesota, and the one you should be following is the one that was handed out this morning, not the one in the packet, because apparently you folks put some time in over the weekend. Is that correct?
Yes, Mr. Chair.
Okay.
Thank you.
Wanted that to be a compliment. Mr. Showalter, if you want to begin the presentation on the governor's changes that took place from the original budget. And now, the last time you were here, you entertained questions as we were going. Do you want to function the same way this morning?
Sure.
Okay. So, members, if you have a question as we're going through the handout, just let us know. Mr. Showalter.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Members, for the record, my name is Jim Showalter, Commissioner of Minnesota Management and Budget. With me is Margaret Kelly, State Budget Director and Assistant Commissioner. We've got just a very brief set of slides for you just to give you an update on the governor's recommendations. Obviously, we've reached that point in the legislative session where the initial governor's recommendation is already done. We've got a February forecast completed, and this basically represents the adjustments that the governor makes to his initial budget recommendations based upon the new information that was in that February forecast. There are a number of different changes that Director Kelly will walk through, and just sort of some of the significant ones, and then we'll give you some of the tables, some of the summary information that's there. All that being said, the first slide after the introduction basically reminds you that the key elements of the governor's recommendations that he presented back in January are still there with the supplemental recommendations. The changes are...
Maybe if somebody could focus that, it's not coming through real sharp.
Is that better? One more. Oh, my fuzzier, I thought when I went there.
I guess I'm told that that's maybe as good as it gets. Okay.
Yeah, it's not beautiful. I'd agree. But the points are still pretty clear and can be identified on our website as well, which is the three just general themes that he had. One was to support a growing economy that creates jobs and expands the middle class. That describes some of the investments in economic development, the collaborative efforts that we tried to look at, problem solving across agencies. Second, that the budget was funded by a tax system where everyone pays their fair share. Have consistently tried to look at tax incidents and trying to look at how the tax structure raises revenues. And then finally, provides public services that gives Minnesotans their best value for the dollar. Knowing that this isn't just about dividing up resources, it is about how you deliver services and results and what kind of strategies and that we can put into place to get there. Director Kelly will take you through the next couple of slides. These are the key changes from his initial recommendations that we came to testify before you before, and how they have changed or not changed in some instances.
Members of the committee, again, my name is Margaret Kelly with Minnesota Management and Budget, and I'm just going to, in these next two slides, highlight the revenue changes and the spending changes in the governor's revised budget. First, with income tax, he continues to support in this budget a fourth tier. He's added to that a renter's credit and additional federal tax conformity, a limited amount of federal tax conformity. He has not included his sales tax proposal. So on the sales tax, what he's proposing in this revised budget is just a small amount of additional sales tax revenue from affiliate Nexus. The big changes in business to business and consumer rate expansion and subsequent rate reduction is not included in this supplemental budget. On the corporate tax side, continues to support or recommend base broadening and a small amount of federal tax conformity that has a positive revenue under the corporate tax line, and some indexing of minimum fees. He's not including in this budget the corporate rate reduction that was in his January package. And finally, on property taxes, he is not including the $500 credit on the income tax, but he still has in his budget on the spending side the local government aid and the county program aid increases. We move on to the spending side. The highlights of the changes in the supplemental budget includes additional debt service for a $750 million bonding bill. In his original budget, he had debt service for a $500 million bonding bill. Also included in this budget is a transition to the new Minnesota Care. You may recall in his original budget he had set aside about $300 million in the Health Care Access Fund so that we could redesign the Minnesota Care program to comply with the Affordable Care Act. And in this supplemental budget, he is putting forward recommendations to leverage additional federal dollars to do that. He has included in this budget an allocation of $80 million for the University of Minnesota. You'll find those detailed recommendations in the university's budget. And he's addressing some deficiencies in a limited number of agencies and a limited number of new investments. Also, you'll find those details in the materials that came along with the transmittal letter under Commissioner Showalter's name.
Okay, we do have a question at this point. Representative Anderson?
I can wait till later.
Oh, you can wait. Okay. I have one on the allocation of $80 million for the University of Minnesota. That, what is different there from, it's the same number, so I think there's a policy change there. So if you could explain what that change is.
Certainly. In his original budget, he had just set aside $80 million in the higher education area pending an audit of the university's administrative expenses. So now he's actually allocating that $80 million first to the university and second to a couple initiatives. One, their MinDrive initiative to improve their research aspect of the institution, and second to contain tuition costs increases.
Okay. Representative Mullery.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't know who to answer it, or is Representative Winchesky here? Anyhow, the question is on the affiliate nexus. Do we run into any problems with, I see you're now taxing if there's just a link or some other things like that on a computer with the streamlined sales, if that's okayed by Congress? If the Main Street bill in Congress passes, do we have does that cause any problems? Or if it doesn't pass, I guess is more the question, with the present law from the Quill decisions.
You know, could I ask maybe the two of you, we didn't ask the Commissioner of Revenue to be here, so if this is something you're comfortable in jumping into, fine. Otherwise, we'll
I can wait.
delay those questions for either the Tax Committee or when we have the Commissioner of Revenue here.
Mr. Chair, Representative, I think that would be helpful. We're not sure.
Yeah, your expertise is a bit more on the spending side, so, okay, very good.
So with that, the next chart just takes you through some of the summary information of what's in the governor's recommendations and how these numbers come together. As we said at the governor's release, it's not about the numbers, it's about the policies and the changes that we're trying to achieve, but sometimes you want to have the numbers too. And so here they are. Starting with the $627 million forecast shortfall, there are changes both to the revenues and to the expenditures in the governor's proposed actions that result in a $8 million balance anticipated for the 2014 and 15 biennium. The changes include $1.8 billion in revenue changes and about $1.2 billion in expenditure changes, enough to, on an ongoing basis and in a matched basis, pay for new investments this biennium, as well as cover the shortfall that we currently have. The way that that is achieved gets into a little bit more detail on the next slide, entitled Small Changes in Revenues and Spendings in the Governor's Revised Budget. What you see here is looking at the incremental changes between what was proposed in January and what was proposed in March. You'll see about $300 million, $298 million change on the taxes side. Between those two figures, $117 million change. I'm sorry, that's I'm going to start one line further. Sorry. Forecast revenues show from the forecast a $323 million improvement. Forecast spending went down by $117 million. You put those two numbers together, you have what we talked about on February 28th as being the forecast change. Under the governor's changes on that chart, you see how we have adjusted the governor's recommendations for that roughly $460 million improvement. You see it split basically between changes in the tax recommendations and the forecast spending changes, ultimately coming down with the changes in the budgetary balance as well. So the next slide then gets you a little bit further in on the revenue pieces. Between January and March, there's about a $1.7 billion change on individual income taxes. That is sometimes confusing to people because it looks like, oh, the governor's raising $1.7 billion in income taxes now. What this represents is the $500 property tax refunds or credits that were proposed in his initial recommendation were removed from his budget recommendations. Those counted as an income tax offset. So when you take away a $1.4 billion credit, the change goes into this column, along with the forecast change that was shown in the previous slide, gets you to that $1.7 billion. Other changes here include changes basically in the corporate income tax. The rate reduction that was initially proposed is not continued in the recommendations and the supplemental recommendations. And the other major moving piece here is the $2.1 billion decrease in the sales and use tax, as Director Kelly suggested and the governor has talked about at length. He is backing off of his initial recommendations for extending the sales tax both on the business-to-business as well as consumer areas. Other changes here are relatively modest, so that in the end you see a total change in revenues between his initial recommendations and his March recommendations of only $26 million. With that, you see the next change is on the, and we're about to get really large, but it's still small numbers, on the spending changes. You'll see on the bottom line here, the spending changes on net are $47 million different than his initial recommendations. The net figures really are relatively small. The biggest of the changes on a net basis is debt service, where his initial recommendations had been estimated at a $500 million capital budget recommendation. This cut includes debt service for a $750 million current year capital budget recommendation. On net, you see $47 million in changes. In Health and Human Services, there are significant moving pieces, as noted earlier, to fill in the plan for extending in Minnesota care going into the future. But on a net basis, the general fund changes are relatively modest. Altogether, what you see then is not that.
Right here.
There we go. Changes going into the future. The shape of the governor's recommendations have changed significantly with the elimination or the withdrawal of the sales tax expansions. Those had significant growth into budget years 15, 16, 17. And as that has been taken out, while the budget change in the 14-15 biennium has been relatively modest, it has withdrawn back the balance in 2016 and 17. As you see here, it still has a structural balance of $305 million without including inflation, but that is not enough to cover the school shift repayment, which had been an initial part of his recommendation. We still anticipate and will be committed to paying back that shift. This is just about enough to pay back the aid payment portion of it in 16-17, and of course current law, which would repay the shift based upon any forecast improvements, would still be in place and would be part of his recommendation. So that summarizes the direction of his recommendations, really keeping the body of his recommendations, but making a significant change on how he raises the revenue. To support that budget recommendation with some modest changes and tweaks, all of which have been outlined and conveyed to you. That document, given current practices and past practices, was submitted to you as supplemental budget update number 1. With it was a detailed list of changes that are included in the numbers that we have just presented to you in the committee, Mr. Chair. So with that, we'd be happy to take any questions that you might have.
And, Mr. Schwalder, being that you mentioned inflation, I know that was in the budget documents. It's not here. What would, if we included inflation, or what is the projected inflation? Let me put it that way. If you've got it at your fingertips.
Mr. Chair, I'm going to take it out of the forecast because it isn't necessarily part of what we show in the budget, and it's only here for informational purposes.
You usually have a footnote is what I'm referring to.
Yeah, in the forecast. And in the forecast on page 9 of the initial summary, it was estimated at about $933 million in 2016 and another $1.3 billion in 2017. That was assuming a 4-year kind of inflation factor so that it was a cumulative amount. I think if for purposes of having a budget on the table, you probably wouldn't have a compounded figure for 4 years, so it would be actually probably significantly smaller than that.
Because you don't know what legislative action would be.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay. Representative Anderson, we'll revert back to you then.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll limit myself here a little bit. I've got 2 questions that I would like to ask. Out of this budget, how many additional FTEs are you adding to the state budget? And then I have one more question after that.
Mr. Schwalder.
Mr. Chair, Representative, we don't have revised numbers, but I'm going to try as I talk to see if I can give you at least a ballpark figure of that. And as we look for it, the FTE figures are basically summaries of all of the detail that's in the biennial budget system. They're probably not, since they're not really a budgeted item, I wouldn't say that that's quite as direct as the revenues and spending numbers that we have, simply because there are choices to be made on how to absorb any cost increases, contract increases, or how to implement actual recommendations. If you want to give me the second question, I will try to look it up even as you give me the question.
And sure, and if you could just provide clarification. So you're saying in the budget itself, we're not really accounting for the additional FTEs, the healthcare costs associated and everything else that is part of adding staff to the state? Is that what you just said?
Mr. Chair, Representative, basically the governor and the legislature have the option of setting a funding level and telling an agency head, here are the resources available for grants or for operations, and we expect you to try to do your best to make that work. There have been times where there have been compensation changes that have, or supplemental recommendations that have been passed along with that base budget to recognize cost pressures. In the governor's recommendations, there was no across-the-board operating change for agency budgets. Basically, it was expected that agencies would work with the operations and administrative appropriations that were provided or recommended within the governor's budget.
So, Mr. Chair.
Representative Anderson.
Commissioner Showalter, am I to assume then that part of an agency's ability to absorb costs might be them increasing fees somewhere else?
Mr. Chair, Representative, that would not be a tool that an agency head has. Basically, you would have to decide how to deliver services more economically. You would have to figure out whether you can not fill other positions, fill positions with lower cost people, simply because fee revenues and the appropriation of those fee revenues are the domain of the legislature.
Okay, and Mr. Chair.
Representative Anderson.
Commissioner Showalter, the last thing that I want to ask you about as you're looking up that information is you've got the cigarette tax as part of the governor's budget. And we all know it's a regressive tax that hits our low-income citizens the hardest. But what I'm more interested in knowing about is what is the backup plan for the governor in his budget? He said that it's very much a priority to have a sustainable budget. Yet, as we've seen time and again, the cigarette tax declines in revenue every single year. And I saw that you have in your handout that you're anticipating that it will decline, which means then that if you go beyond the out biennium, we're going to have a situation where, quite honestly, the revenue is not going to be coming in and we're going to have a shortfall. So what is the governor's plan to fill in the gap by relying on the cigarette tax for funding his budget?
Commissioner Showalter.
Mr. Chair, Representative, I'm trying to understand the question because the information we presented basically shows you the 2016 and 17 revenues, and we anticipate a structurally balanced budget going into the future, that the revenues that are recommended more than cover the anticipated costs and commitments based upon the current law recommendation.
Mr. Chair.
Representative Anderson.
Commissioner Showalter, I'm actually looking at the M&B handout here, the big one. Mm-hmm. I'm looking on page 16 out of the 21 pages.
Okay.
And if you look under the increased cigarette and tobacco products excise tax and you're looking under revenue, you guys have already accounted for lower revenue in the 2016-2017 when you compare it to 2014-2015. Mm-hmm. So I'm assuming that you are basing that off of the fact that you will have a decline in revenue from this source. Mm-hmm. If you aren't considering that, you need to, because we just heard in tax committee a couple of weeks ago the fact that there is a decline in our cigarette tax revenue and tobacco products. So you should have that as part of your configuration. And my question to you is, since we know and have proof that this is a declining revenue source, what is your backup plan? Because this revenue is not going to be coming in to support the overall budget beyond even the 2016-2017 biennium.
Showalter.
Mr. Chair, Representative, first of all, the assumptions in the forecast do project declines in tobacco consumption. So the notion that these are based on assumptions of constant or past, smoking isn't the case. We do have people looking at the industry and to generate these figures. Two is, I appreciate you actually pointing this out, because the interaction between the governor's recommendations to increase cigarette taxes, have a reduction, basically impact our current revenues, because the health impact fee would decrease. So again, we're taking into account the interaction that higher prices will drive lower anticipated smoking and lower anticipated revenues. Those are all included in the figures that we're showing here. We're not anticipating tobacco revenues to completely disappear in 2016 and 17, and don't have any data that would suggest that that is going to happen. We are taking into account the impact of both price and changes in basically people's habits in the revenue estimates for tobacco revenues.
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Showalter, I'm not sure that this is going to completely do, though, what you're anticipating, because what we'll most likely see is not so much people discontinuing smoking altogether, but instead buying their products outside of the state. For example, we have several border communities from the Moorhead area to Worthington to all these different communities where it's just a hop, skip, and a jump to go over the border and buy their products there. And so that's more what I'm concerned about, is you're still going to have people that are going to be consumers of cigarette and tobacco products, and yet we will see a decline in revenue. And I'm curious as to what the backup plan is for that. But I appreciate your time. I don't want to give other people a chance to ask questions as well.
And Mr. Chair, Representative, great question. Certainly something that was discussed, and perhaps when the Department of Revenue comes in, we could talk about that in a little bit more detail, because that is certainly a factor in discussing and estimating the revenues. Just for the record, it is still at least one border is secured. Wisconsin's cigarette taxes is still a little bit higher than Minnesota's, based upon the governor's recommendations.
Okay, Representative Woodard.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Commissioner Showalter, you mentioned that the governor's budget does bring us back to a structural balance, except for one thing, and that's the payment of the school shift. And you mentioned that in this handout that we have here, I think the one that's up there, that $305 million would be the surplus at 2016-2017. And you mentioned that would pay off the aid portion of the shift, but that is only about 3/4 of that, right?
Mr. Chair, Representative, yeah, it's actually our best guess, and I don't have firm data from the Department of Education, but the aid payment remaining for that biennium would be about $310 million. There's also the property tax recognition shift,
right,
which is a separate shift that would still need to be repaid.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And then Commissioner Showalter, so at what point did the governor think, I know it's not in the numbers here, but at what point are we going to pay off the shift?
Mr. Chair, Representative, in all likelihood, it will be in the next several years, but it isn't an item that, based upon the revenues that he has in this budget, we could say that we had clearly budgeted for in 2016 and 17. We obviously haven't budgeted for the more than 1.3 or more billion dollars that we've recently paid back in the shifts. So the mechanism that the state has had in law has been a very successful one, and we would continue and recommend that. We would continue to use that as our revenues hopefully get better with the economy.
Representative Woodard.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I just have two more follow-up questions. I think they're pretty quick. One is, so based on that, I've heard that statement certainly in testimony in the K-12 education finance hearings, that people say that the shift isn't really that big of a deal and that paying it back is not a priority. So based on that, the thing that worries me is the governor committed in the next 2 years, or is we work through these budgets not to increase the shift?
Mr. Chair, Representative, absolutely committed not to increasing the shift, and in fact, he's done exactly what you would hope, which is taken every available dollar as the budget has improved to paying back the shift. And that's how we've gotten to the space that we're in right now.
Okay. And then, Mr. Chair, just one final question. So absolutely, I like that answer. So I will definitely write that one down. Thank you. And then the $1.8 billion that we still have roughly in increased revenue that the governor's asking for, right, 1.7 and some change. What percentage of that, and you can certainly correct me on that number, but what percentage of that then is going to increase spending within the K-12 arena?
Mr. Chair, Representative, looking for that breakout, because I think we've only shown you changes from the initial recommendations. So we're going to have to dig out our initial recommendations to give you the total K-12 number. It was one of the things we testified to when we were here earlier,
Well, Mr. Chair,
and I'll get that for you in 1 second.
yeah, and what might help is a little background on that question, Commissioner. I think originally with the initial tax increases the governor was asking for was about 9% of those tax increases would go to K-12 because it was about $334 million out of the $3.8 billion or $3.7 billion. So is that number obviously increases a bit, right?
A bit, Mr. Chair. Do you want to try and start it?
Mr. Chair, Representative, about $640 million of the expenditures, the $1.2 billion of expenditures, is going towards K-12 education.
Oh, no, that's not what you're
And that's between early education and K-12 schools and higher education.
I want higher ed.
And higher ed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, Representative Khan.
This is more a comment to members of the committee than to the testifiers, but all of those who are concerned about border crossing to avoid taxes, I assume this means that you'll support either as a bill or as an amendment on the House floor the elimination of the Sunday sales prohibition for alcohol in Minnesota, as every state and every province around us sells alcohol on Sunday. And this is definitely a tax issue, and and we should clearly move on this at this time. It's also a way of getting government out of people's hair and restoring church and state separation. Just a comment.
And I suspect if it were more than just a comment, it would generate quite a debate. So,
Well, this didn't seem, there wasn't a bill in front of us to put the amendment on. Otherwise, of course, I would have. But
okay, Representative Dean.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Welcome back, Mr. Showalter. Just a couple of things. I was looking through the larger packet for the healthcare balance in the healthcare account. Is that in here, and is there any one-time changes from the healthcare access account into this for the budget? And it's probably in the packet, and I'm just not seeing it.
Mr. Schultz.
Mr. Chair, Representative, we do not include in the packet the Healthcare Access Fund as it stands with the governor's recommendations. That should be up on the MMB webpage tomorrow. But included in the governor's recommendation is additional transfers from the general fund into the Healthcare Access Fund to facilitate the transitioning to a new Minnesota Care. That's a big element of his changes in the Health and Human Services area.
Mr. Chair, and Ms. Kelly, do you know off the top of your head, round numbers, what that might be for the biennium?
I believe it was about $65 million of additional transfers from the general fund to the Healthcare Access Fund for fiscal year 14.
Thank you. And, Mr. Chair, and Mr. Showalter, just kind of looking at a global picture, we got a little bit of good news, almost $500 million to the good. Things moving forward, understand that. That's good news. And as I'm looking through the budget for Better Minnesota, just kind of the priorities and changes, we see some, as you said, some moving around. That we see a little bit more in taxes. They actually went up for individual income taxes. We're actually, even though we got the good news that we're actually raising income taxes a little bit, and that I see that we're having just a little bit more for K-12, $9 million, more for K-12, and about $2 million more for Health and Human Services, as and that kind of moving forward. And my question is, that this is reflective of the governor's priorities with finding this additional money and kind of heading out around, listening to lots of people. Those changes, very small increase, $9 million in K-12, and just a couple million in Health and Human Services. You said earlier that every available dollar was going to pay back the shift, but couldn't some of that new money, that $500 million that kind of washed up, couldn't we have used more of that to pay back the shift?
Mr. Chair, Representative, I want to draw your attention to slide number 2 in the numerical. It's basically, it is, here you go. Just to make sure we're talking about the same numbers, in the terms of the forecast changes, you see there that second line shows forecast revenues went up by $323 million. The governor's recommendations basically tried to reduce his recommendations by $298 million in terms of how much his total tax recommendations would be. So a significant portion of the forecast change went to reducing the revenue that was requested. In addition, the forecast spending went down by $117 million. The governor basically recommended $165 million in new spending, but on net, basically, you see they're fairly close. So just in terms of the premise of the question, the governor didn't increase overall taxes in his tax recommendations when the forecast got better. What he did was he drew back on the sales tax elements and also drew back on the property tax checks, which show up in the income tax area. So that's how you get the decrease in revenues that we show on this slide. So in terms of the spending changes, there aren't a lot of net changes between his initial recommendations and these recommendations. So to your point of could we have put more money into the shift? Only without displacing or taking out some of his initial recommendations. What current law does is says that money that's already essentially in the bank, or at least in the current fiscal year that's already been budgeted, is available for paying back the shift. And that money has already been allocated and devoted to paying back the shift. When we talk about the larger changes that are in 2014 and 15, those are still projected changes and part of the budget recommendations.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Mr. Showalter, I think it does kind of go back to priorities, and I think Representative Woodard brought that up, and correctly so. And just final question is, I saw Commissioner Franz around the state. I was going around the editorial boards. He had his stool there with the three-legged stool. Is that still around? Do we still have the stool? I was hoping he would bring it in today to see if it actually had changed.
Mr. Chair, Representative, unfortunately, I don't have a copy of the stool. I assume it still exists. And unfortunately, some of the problems that will still have to be addressed in terms of longer-term tax reform and trying to address sales tax. And hopefully, at least on the federal side, some of the Main Street fairness could help. But some of those challenges are still there.
Commissioner Franz mainly comes into the tax committee, so maybe there will be an opportunity to see the stool there.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair and Mr. Showalter. And since Mr. Rukavina is not here to say it, I'll say it. You got a tough job to do. You're just doing your job. So, since he's not here to say it, I'll say it.
Someone's taking you on.
Hey, Representative Detmer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Commissioner Showalter. On page 20 of the Governor's Supplement Budget Summary, could you just explain the Veterans Affairs, where the Governor's original budget miscalculated the costs there? Could you just explain that?
Yeah.
Sure. Mr. Chair, Representative, the original recommendation was to put a veterans lottery ticket out there. This recommendation here recognizes the fact that when we do a new lottery ticket, there is a loss of general fund revenue. At the grocery store, there is a box for lottery tickets, and there's only room for a set number of tickets, and when you put a new ticket in, you need to take a ticket out. And so when you dedicate the revenue of a lottery ticket to a specific purpose, and you replace an existing lottery ticket, there is a loss of general fund revenue because of that. And so this just recognizes the loss of general fund revenue because of the governor's budget recommendation to dedicate a lottery ticket to the vets.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
That takes care of Representative Aber.
Thought the list was longer. I came late, so I'm sorry about that. I had two other things simultaneous to this. But in the last budget, I was trying to figure out how much money we're really raising. And the media kept saying $2.1 billion, but I figured it was $3.7 billion of new money, and then we spent some, or you spent some, or proposed to spend some on property tax credits and all that. So, and so I figured the new revenue coming in was 3.7, and we bought things with it. And so you're bringing in less revenue now. But so on page 3, is my math correct in terms of the new revenues that we're raising would be the individual tax, corporate, statewide property tax, and the non-tax revenues? And so the new revenue coming in would be a total of, I added those up, I got 2.218. So is that a fair way to say how much new revenue we're getting? Is that fair?
Commissioner?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, Representative, basically, if you look at the slide that Margaret just put up, you see the revenue figure. So total revenues forecast in the February forecast were $36.1 billion. The governor is recommending a total revenue package of $37.9 billion, a change of $1.8 billion.
Right.
The major offset or sort of decrease in revenues that was in his initial package, the property tax refunds, isn't there.
Right.
So I think
Well, maybe I'll just
sort of seeing the revenue number here.
Okay, well, let's go to plate. If you go to, thank you, Mr. Sorry. If you go to page 3, then, the cigarette and tobacco tax line is minus 11.
Oh.
And that's just a forecast change or something. And then all the taxes are 58, and those are forecast changes.
Yep.
And then so those are kind of, I mean, you have to raise the money to let those offsets give you credit. So in terms of the new pennies you're collecting from somebody, there's $2.218 billion of new pennies and dollars collected, and then they're offset with some other savings that come in. But in terms of people that are going to notice a change in their taxes, there's $2.2 billion worth of people are going to notice a change, and then some other people are going to get a small change because of just forecast. Am I looking at that the right way?
Mr. Chair, Representative, I'm trying to get to the $2.2 billion figure off of this chart. So maybe could you just help me?
Yeah, so if you add up individual, it's 1.728, corporate's 372, statewide property tax is 34, and then non-tax revenues is 84. And those add up to 2.218. Those are people paying more money for those line items, and there's some people getting a discount because of some other things, but they might be different people. Is that fair, Mr. Showalter?
Mr. Chair, Representative, I'm not, obviously you can cut the numbers any way you want. The individual income tax number, that you started with, as I tried to explain, this is a change from his initial recommendation, so it's not so much an increase, it's the absence of the property tax checks of $500 apiece, roughly $1.4 billion. So that is sort of the driver, along with the forecast change of around $300 million between $1.7 billion. So it's not, that's basically the numerical change between his initial recommendations and what you see in front of you. So in terms of trying to get to a $2.1 billion increase in taxes, I'm still trying to figure out the logic of using this chart. This is basically showing forecast plus policy changes in the governor's recommendations.
So, Mr. Chair, well then, maybe there's a different, I'm not trying to be clever, I'm just trying to figure this out. So this is the governor's changes, sort of, but...
Plus forecast changes.
Yeah. Is there a chart that says how much individual income tax is going to go up from current law, and how much corporate's going to change, and how much sales and use, and how much cigarette taxes? And all those ones are going to change from current?
Yep.
That breakdown?
But yeah.
And maybe you don't have that with you.
Mr. Chair and Representative, the slide that's up on the screen, it's numbered 1. It's the second number 1 slide in your deck. Shows that between all of the revenue changes in the governor's budget compared to the February forecast, it's a $1.8 billion increase in revenues. We don't have this broken down between how much is coming from cigarette tax versus sales tax versus corporate tax. We can provide that.
Okay, well, Mr. Chair.
Representative Gavel.
And so I'm sorry I misread the chart. Maybe you could help me, and if you could get a similar chart to us, or to me at least, on this summary of current law to what the latest thing is, counting everything, so we can really know what the governor is proposing. Because you were comfortable last time, me saying that there was $3.7 billion of new money coming in from various sources. And I've been not very loud about it, but I was sad that out of that, minus $69 million went to human services. And I'm happy for the additional $2 million in that, but I'm just curious what proportion of the governor's, whatever number he's going to have, is going to go to human services and other parts. So thanks. That would be helpful. I'm sorry I misread the chart.
No, and Mr. Chair, Representative, I mean, it's a good question. I've got some draft information, basically trying to look at the preliminary fund balance. I think the chart that you saw, that's I think still up, showing $1.83 billion in revenues. The only major sort of tax, negative tax item is federal conformity. So basically, the revenue number that you see here on the screen is essentially the tax conformity is worth about $15 million. So total tax changes from the governor compared with February forecast is $1.84 billion.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Sorry to drag that out, but that was helpful. So.
Are there any other questions? Representative Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was just wondering if Commissioner Showalter has that number on the FTEs, if you could.
Yes. Good. I'll have to go find it. The chart that we have is all funds, so it's not a general fund versus general fund chart. It's all funds. The other thing that I want to note is the major changes are in just a couple of agencies. In human services, in corrections, in natural resources, those changes seem to drive the bottom line figure.
Mr. Chair, Representative, it's within state agencies alone, it's 946 FTEs. This was a preliminary number with the governor's January budget release. We have continued to work on revising it for accuracy and should have something in the next couple of days that is updated for his March budget recommendations. If you include the judicial branch, so all branches of state government, all funds, it's about 1,000. About a third of those increases in FTEs are for areas where there was a base adjustment done, so where spending had been decreased last year and continued to decrease in this current next biennium, and adjusting for those, about a third of them came out of corrections and judiciary, where the governor made decisions to avoid layoffs in those areas, and then about a third of them are for new positions.
Can you say that last part again? You were saying that a third are new positions and a third are for judicial.
Correct. So in the governor's budget, he is putting resources into judicial branch and into corrections as well to avoid layoffs in those areas, because costs have continued to increase, and without compensation adjustments in those areas, there would have been significant layoffs, and he's avoiding that with this budget. It's about a third of the increases in FTEs account for that, because in the budget system we reflect the fact that those positions would have gone away. Also, there were positions that did not continue in the base budget that, due to one-time funding changes, and the governor increased funding in those areas, and so it's not necessarily new positions, but continuing positions that had been funded on a one-time basis.
Okay, Representative Huntley.
Mr. Chair and Commissioner Showalter, in terms of the FTEs and Health and Human Services, the numbers you've got there, does that include those that will be fully paid by the federal government in terms of the Medicaid expansion?
Mr. Chair, Representative, yes. And that's where the all funds distinction is really important, because there are federal funds that would go with that. It's probably driving that number. I don't have a breakup by fund.
Okay, any other questions? Representative Holbert.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Commissioner. Can you enlighten the committee a little bit on what planning's being done relative to sequestration, and should we look for any additional information from the governor's office as within the next couple weeks? Hopefully we know whether this continuing resolution at the federal level reflects a sequestration level of funding or not, and if there's any impacts that the administration views will occur either in the current biennium or the biennium in which we're budgeting for.
Sure. Mr. Chair, Representative, great question on sequestration. Basically, how do we manage federal funds? I'm going to open, and Director Kelly has had some specific discussions just in the last couple of weeks about planning for how we manage it. I just want to set up for the committee, and most of you know that federal funds come into the state, are reviewed by the legislature, and spent by agencies based upon that authorization and approval process. When those federal funds go away, agencies have to make plans to not spend that money. It is as if we're contractors for the federal government delivering those services. In a case of sequestration, that can be some significant impact. A couple of agencies in particular, Deed and Health Department, probably are going to be the most impacted by sequestration. The timing of it, though, is really an issue of understanding exactly what our federal counterparts are planning, and that can be difficult to get through. They have concepts of budget authority as well as outlays, and so that means that even if the sequestration has impacts in the federal fiscal year, current federal fiscal year, you may not see all of the impact immediately at the state level.
Mr. Chair, Representative, we are communicating back and forth, agencies and MMB, regarding sequestration to try and understand the impact on the state's federal budget, federal revenue. And it's a day-by-day communication from the federal government, one federal agency at a time. Like Commissioner said, I think the first impact we'll see is in the Department of Employment and Economic Development, in which they will need to scale back the scope of services they provide in voc rehab, as well as the level of service that they provide. They are continuing to try and understand what the federal guidance means to their agencies. The second agency I think that will be most impacted is the Department of Health. They're about 50% federal funded, and much of their funding comes from grants that are covered by the sequestration. And so they are working with the feds to understand the timing of those reductions and how they need to implement them, whether they can reduce the scope or whether they need to reduce the value of services. So there will be impacts on our vaccination programs, our WIC programs, other infectious disease activity. The third agency, I think, is the Department of Education, and much of the impact will be passed through to school districts, and we are still working to understand the timing of those reductions and don't have a lot of guidance from the federal government yet.
And
Representative Holbert.
thank you, Mr. Chair and Ms. Kelly. Have you or any of your commissioners identified any vital activities that will need backfill of state dollars in order to avoid some type of catastrophic consequence?
Mr. Chair and Representative Holberg, I think that commissioners are identifying the extent to which their grants will be reduced and understanding the impact of that. The governor is not including in his supplemental recs backfilling at this point in time.
All right, thank you.
Representative Mahoney.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And as far as the sequestration goes, particularly for Deed, with many of its programs, I believe there's something called maintenance of effort. How will that maintenance of effort funding from the state of Minnesota be affected, and what will be the rules, so to speak? If the federal government cuts back 30%, do we still need to maintain that 30% that is typically done for maximum maximum grant, I think it is?
Mr. Chair, Representative, that's a really good question, and I think there's a lot of ambiguity about that, and it's sort of federal agency by federal agency. But my understanding was that to the extent that federal grants were reduced, that our maintenance of effort requirements would be reduced as well. But that's an agency by agency issue that we're still clarifying.
Representative Mahoney.
When do you expect to get clarification on that?
Mr. Chair, that's a very good question as well, and I don't know if I have an answer to that.
Mr. Chair, I remember testifying in front of this committee regarding the stimulus funds, and the announcement of the stimulus funds led everyone to wonder what the immediate impact was going to be or the availability, and it took many months for us to discern that. It seems that the same is true on the downside. Not only when we have new funds, but it's also when the funds go away, that it takes a little while to exactly discern what the impacts are going to be.
Okay, any other questions? Well, seeing none, then thank you very much. By way of Wednesday night, I did mention at the beginning of the meeting we'll have the House budget resolution before us. I'm not totally sure when that's going to be released, so relative to amendments to the House budget resolution, we will not use the 24-hour rule. It may be released early enough, but just in case, we'll waive that, although with the LCCMR bill, being that has been announced, we'll continue to use the 24-hour rule relative to that one for the committee. So if there aren't any other comments, with that, thank you, and meeting adjourned.